After the death of Leah Betts from ecstasy that the Essex boys had supplied, they should have been keeping a low profile.
Those who deal with drugs are dealing with death, and the place for them to be is off the streets behind a metal door.
However, greed and debts from their failed drugs foray to Amsterdam drove them into keeping the planned rendezvous with the East End drug dealers. Tucker, using his usual business techniques, planned to double-cross the East Enders, leaving with their money and their drugs, unaware that he was about to become a victim of an even deadlier double-cross.
Go on, do 'em!
Their greed had cost them their lives.
They were taken completely by surprise. I think that was certainly the impression given, and it was a cold-blooded professional hit.
Could have been undertaken by one person, but highly unlikely. In all probability, two, and those two have still got to leave the scene, so that includes another person. They've got to leave the scene very quickly. They've got firearms in their possession. You're not going to walk down the road with guns on show or tucked under your coat or your jacket. Transport away is essential.
Once you have more than one person involved in a murder, you've got two possible informers.
Some months pass while the police investigate this triple gangland killing. Undercover policemen suspect local villain Darren Nichols of being involved. Perhaps he was the hitman's getaway driver.
The police ain't got big radar on their head and going, he's a gangster, he's a villain, he's this, he's an armed robber, he's this and that. They can only get it by people telling them.
The police needed a supergrass to crack the case. A sting was put in place. Nichols was persuaded to transport a cannabis shipment in his car. He was then caught red-handed.
Excuse me, sir, can I see the proof of your car, please?
Could Nichols be persuaded to become the supergrass in return for a shorter sentence on the drugs charge?
Darren Nichols got nicked for the importation. He's basically couldn't handle going back to prison, doing the bird, whatever you want to call it.
Informants become informants for several reasons, including altruism, money and self-preservation. And it seems that Nichols became an informant for the last two reasons.
Supergrass Darren Nichols, who had a history of acting as a paid police informer, identified his old partners in crime, Michael Steele and Jack Womes, as the two murderers. Nichols admitted to being their driver on the night.
Darren Nichols gave information out of fear and self-preservation, his own life. He knew what those people were capable of, Steele and Womes. He knew. He drove them away from the scene. He knew what they were capable of.
Based almost solely on the evidence of the supergrass Nichols, this is what the prosecution alleged led to the gangland killing of the Essex boys. Tucker had put unbearable pressure on Steele and Womes to return all the money from the previous drugs run from Amsterdam, where the cannabis had turned out to be substandard. Resenting this pressure, the prosecution claimed Steele turned on the three men who blamed him for the failure, and also suggested that Steele had his own mole planted in the East End organisation with whom the Essex boys were about to do business.
Hello? Yes, Tony.
He asked this contact to ring Tucker and set them up for a fateful recce of the drop site.
Fuck! What? Fuck! What?
Ah, get a load of your face!
You fucking wind me up! What the fuck's that? Who the fuck was that?
That was Sammy. The deal's on. We're all
Sweet Tate! Fucking sweet.
Steele tells Tucker that he has personally heard from his own contacts within the gang and now knows exactly where the aircraft will land. He offers to meet him and his henchmen, Tate and Rolfe, later that evening, to guide them to the spot near Rettendon and arrange a rehearsal for the landing the next night. A Range Rover containing Tucker, Tate and Rolfe arrives in the pub car park just outside Rettendon. Nichols and Womes go on ahead to unlock the gate in the field. And Mick Steele joins the others to show them the way. The scene is now set for one of the nastiest, most brutal killings of the 20th century.
The prosecution case essentially was that these men had been lured into this trap, were completely unaware that they were the targets rather than the drugs that they thought that they were going to get hold of.
The field in which the plane will be landing the following day is just at the end of the lane.
Craig was driving, Tony was next to him in the passenger seat, Pat was in the back with somebody. They drove down the Rettendon Turnpike. They was looking for what Tony, Pat and Craig believed was another easy job, to mug some dealers, take a load of stuff.
The entrance is being barred by a securely locked gate.
Pat's seen the pump action, gone like that. Bang, Craig, bang. Tony, Craig. Tony and Craig didn't know a thing. You think of a loud bang in that confined space, you're going to you wouldn't even know, they didn't even know what happened. They were dead before they even heard the second sound of the gun.
The people were waiting where they thought they were going to have the switch over. Instead of getting a commodity, they got killed. Because obviously the people whose toes they were treading on were heavy people.
Yeah, it was only a matter of time when three got killed. Just a matter of time, because I was catching everybody, having everybody over, just chucking away about in general where they could.
Well, what's got them killed was obviously greed. They'd been doing this, they'd been tucking people up, and that was the carrot that was put under the front of the donkey's nose. It was a big one, and they threw caution to the wind and just went for it, which the people obviously knew that they would.
They might indeed have been tempted by the carrot of £1 million drop. Shared with their old enemies and supposedly current cronies, the East London gang, and then paid for their greed with their lives. But what really happened that fateful December night in 1995? By the mid-1990s, the fame of the Essex boys had spread. In autumn 1995, an East London gang had seen their potential profits from a cannabis drop disappear into an Essex pond. The Essex boys had offered to safeguard the next shipment with a view of double-crossing the London gang, only to fall victim to a double cross themselves, much closer to home.
One of the most striking things about the evidence of the bodies was that one of them had his mobile phone in his hand, one of them was in the driving seat, and the implication was that it had been an extremely professional hit. They hadn't even had time to get out of the car and make a run for it.
Tate, Tucker and Rolfe was shot with the most precision you could ever see. You know, it wasn't... It was a marksman that shot those three guys.
The bloody execution of 3 of the Essex boys' gang led to a massive police investigation. This threw a spotlight on the Essex underworld and on the police to make arrests.
If 3 people get executed
in what is obviously a gang killing. And it's in the context of a drug scene out there in Essex, which was widely known about to be pretty bad and pretty out of control. You can take it as read that very, very senior people in the Home Office and the police forces, quite possibly outside Essex, will make phone calls and say, I don't know what's going on down there, but will somebody please sort this out?
I think the police knew right from the start that they'd been killed by people who knew them well, so they were already looking at a limited number of people in that particular underworld.
Essex police had encouraged Darren Nichols to become a supergrass, and he, in turn, had identified Michael Steele and Jack Womes as the two murderers. But without any corroborating evidence, it took nearly 2 years to bring the case to trial. There were no forensics, no footprints, no DNA, nothing to connect Steele and Womes directly to the murders. The barrister who subsequently acted for Michael Steele in his attempts to get the case appealed finds this strange.
The allegation was that the killers of the 3 men in the vehicle had crossed a field which was covered in snow, that around the car there would have been footprints, that there were sweetie papers in the back of a car in which it was claimed that my client had travelled, and yet there was no DNA found.
On the floor there was a crisp packet and a topic wrapper. Now, if there was no DNA at the scene, how did someone eat all them crisps? So there was DNA there.
There was not a scintilla of DNA evidence. All of it is absurd. I mean, it really is strange that there was no science. No science.
But was it that odd?
When the police arrived at the scene where the Range Rover was with the 3 bodies inside, it had been snowing, but a thaw had set in. So had there been any evidence within the snow, it could have evaporated away, as it were. Who is to say that the 2 witnesses who found the bodies, when they arrived, and they clearly had to go to the Range Rover, they looked around, so their footprints could in fact have damaged possibly some evidence that may have been there.
But some things were undisputedly a bit odd that fateful night.
Tate, Tuck and Rolfe went down that lane unarmed. They was villains known to have weapons around them. But why would they go down that lane if they was going to a drug deal or a temporary drug deal or even to a double cross, what they say? Why did they not go with guns? There was no guns at the scene.
Failing any forensics, the key evidence was the word of Darren Nichols.
Nichols, who claims to have been the driver for Womes and Steele on the night of the events, was later caught transporting a large amount of cannabis in the boot of his car. It seems that the police took a lenient view of this and offered other perks.
Without any forensic evidence, Nichols' evidence was crucial for the prosecution.
This was a case which was quite unusual in that the absolute core of the evidence against the men in the dog was the evidence of an informer, the evidence of somebody who had himself been a criminal, who was himself somebody who had been involved in serious crime. He basically did a deal that he would give evidence against others in order to save his own skin.
Obviously he didn't do it for nothing. He was the sort of man probably that would do anything rather than go in prison.
He knew that he was also in the frame, quite possibly, as somebody who was party to murder, multiple murders. That was the great threat that hung over him.
Since the 1970s, the police had successfully used grasses to spill the beans in return for perks. By the 90s, the police were no longer allowed to elicit information with large payments.
The concern was that if those sorts of inducements are available, might they in some way encourage people to lie, to develop a story in a way that's not truthful, and that justice itself is put in jeopardy because of the incentives available to somebody who is essentially a criminal and therefore untrustworthy by his very nature.
As they listened to Darren's evidence, some reporters suspected him of embroidering the facts.
Darren Nichols claimed that one of the alleged murderers had said that as they left the scene of the murders, that he felt like the angel of death. And I suppose it always seems odd that somebody comes up with such a helpful soundbite as they depart from the scene of a crime. And I think that certainly struck me and struck other reporters at the time.
Apart from Nichols' colourful testimony, the only other significant evidence came from mobile phone records. This was an area which was hotly contested over 4 days by legal experts on both sides. On the 6th of December, several calls were made between Nichols to the defendants. The prosecution argued that Jack Womes was briefing him as the getaway driver, but John Womes has an alternative explanation.
My brother Jack, of the morning of the murders, Darren Nichols, the Supergrass, rang Jack up and said, my car's broken down on the way to work. And he said, would you pick it up, Jack? And Jack said, no, Darren, I'm working on the docks. And which he was. He said, I'll pick it up later.
Darren, where are you, buddy?
Just before 7 p.m. on the evening of the murders, the records show 2 4-second calls were made by Womes to Nichols. The prosecution alleged that they were made by Womes to summon the getaway vehicle after the murder. But were they?
After Jack had finished work, he goes and gets Darren's car and rings Darren up and says, Darren, I've got your car. I'll take it back to the workshop. And Darren said, fine. And that's what Jack done, brought the car back to the workshop. That's where they say that Jack rang Darren to say, I've just shot him, come and get me.
Neither side could conclusively prove what was said, but it gave the prosecution a corroborating factor in placing the men in conversation at the time.
It was essential evidence because it corroborated a lot of the evidence that Darren Nichols would give and was proved to be correct, and it also had him, Nichols, in touch with Steele and Womes prior to and at the time of the murders being committed.
There were other little bits of evidence to do with phone calls, mobile phones and so on, but essentially it was, believe the Supergrass, believe the defendants, make your choice, and the jury made their choice.
After a trial lasting almost 5 months and a lengthy deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict, and the judge sent Steele and Womes down for 3 life sentences. But not everyone thinks that the jury got it right.
They must have upset someone and grasses fitted them up for the job. And it wasn't them. I would bet my whole life on it.
In 2004, Helena Kennedy QC argued that the case should be reviewed on the basis of new evidence.
Darren Nichols, with the assistance of the police, it had to be, decided to do a deal for a book, for a documentary and for a film, and he had to get that in the bag before even the committal proceedings in the case. What the jury did not know was that he'd been offered a deal for a book. They had no knowledge of that.
No, let's have a look in there.
This media deal would have given Nichols the money to start a new, comfortable life with a new identity, and would have replaced the financial rewards that the police were no longer allowed to offer criminals in return for grassing.
Did he elaborate this story to make it good for a movie, to make it good for a book on crime, to make it a bestseller? Did he tell a story that was fundamentally flawed? Now, we don't know, but the jury should have been told what had gone on.
This information was not given to the jury.
If we had known absolutely everything about what Darren Nichols had been doing at the time he was giving evidence in this trial, could the trial have gone the other way? And they called quite a lot of witnesses to look at this. They looked at the people who'd been writing the books and arranged the books, and they looked again at the policemen, and they looked where they went back over all this ground. And then in the end, the appeal court said, actually the trial would have come out with the same result.
With the right to appeal having been rejected, and now having spent 14 years in jail, their refusal to admit their crime means that the pair are ineligible for parole.
They've always pleaded, not me, not me, not me. Well,
most people would break, wouldn't they? But if you didn't do it, you wouldn't break.
My father, in April, died. Just before he died, the week before he died, he visited my brother. And he said to my brother Jack, "Just a minute, Jack, so you can go home and look after your mother. I'm dying." My brother Jack said, "No, I can't. I can't do that. I'm not admitting to something I've never done."
We may never know for certain whether Steele and Wombs committed these gruesome murders. But only Darren Nichols, the supergrass, actually managed to walk away from the carnage of the Essex Boys gang and hide in the shadows for the rest of his life.